The High Elves, one of the best races in Warhammer 3, and actually one of the best races in Total War Warhammer ever since they were introduced in Warhammer 2. The core design of the High Elves, ever since they were created in Warhammer 2, has generally been very strong. Their basic lineup of units is one of the best in the entire game. DLC does add to it, but the High Elves are certainly an incredibly powerful race. They could just use a bit of a tune-up. Now, compared to some of the races in this game that do desperately need a rework or rebalancing, the High Elves are fairly low on the list. That doesn't mean they don't have certain issues, because they absolutely do have them. This is something I've talked about roughly 2 months ago, but it is a point worth repeating. Something that has become very clear to me as I've been replaying High Elf campaigns. So recently, over the last couple of days, I've played the Tyrion campaign, I've played the Alain of campaign, and I've played the Sinnelleos campaign, turn 43. High Elves can achieve a lot in their campaigns very quickly. Like, I control the entirety of Ulthuan and a good portion of southern Nagrand over here. And the rest of it is controlled by Alifanar, who isn't quite my ally. He's pissed because I declared war on the Sisters of Twilight and wiped them out, but he certainly has good relations with me. And I am certainly going to start building my way towards confederating him. Fun fact, by the way, in this campaign, for most of it, the Defender of Ulthuan mechanic, which is Alariel's unique campaign mechanic, was actually bugged and was not giving me positive effects, so it was permanently stuck in negative. I'm not quite sure what that happened, but when I loaded the save after hours of playing, it suddenly started working. Thanks, game. Might want to use a mod. If you do encounter this issue, just restart your game. Apparently that fixes it. So let's talk a bit about the High Elves. What do they do so exceptionally well? In fact, they do it so exceptionally well that every other playstyle they might have can feel fairly bland in comparison. So let's consider this. The basic High Elven army, assuming I even have a basic High Elven army at this point. But yeah, the basic High Elven units are the Spearmen and the Archers. You can recruit Spearmen and Archers without armor from any settlement. Doesn't matter what climate it is, you will be able to recruit these guys from every single settlement. These guys are very effective. Spearmen are fairly solid line holders, whereas Archers have a fairly good amount of range and can do a fairly decent amount of damage. In point of fact, this works very well with the research you have access to early on in your campaign, because you get archery prowess, which increases the reload time reduction of your archers and Lothern Sea Guard. And then you can get militia training, which increases the recruit rank of your spearmen and archers. And then you can get precise fletching, which gives missile strength and ammunition. And then couple that with the lord skills that you do have on every single lord that increases reload time reduction and ammunition, and you have yourself a very potent early game army. Probably one of the best combination of units in the entire game. And you can use this combination of units throughout the entire course of your campaign. It will be effective. The one issue that this particular army type does have is a lack of armor piercing, so heavily armored units will win against this. But most of the time, the AI is not going to be able to use proper tactics against a High Elven army, and so you end up in situations where you not only win, but you win with relatively minor casualties, and you win hands down against most of what the AI can throw against you. It is a fairly effective and capable army. And you also have great lore choices available in your campaign. You have Archmages from the Warden and the Paunch DLC, the Princes and Princesses, which come by default. You also have a significant amount of power to these lords, as you can get positive traits that either, for instance, reduce upkeep or give themselves a power buff. On top of that, a lot of the lore choices have the Merchant Lord ability, which increases tradable resources. That is going to become very important. But regardless, High Elves have a very effective Lord roster, a very effective basic army type. And they also have very powerful Legendary Lords with a great variety in their campaigns. Play a Alifanar, play a Skaven Legendary Lord as the High Elves. That's what Alifanar is. Play a Lariel and play one of the best Empire builders in the entire campaign. Play Tyrion and have access to one of the best baseline Legendary Lords in the entire freaking game. I actually don't have Tyrion over here because I wanted to reskill him, but suffice to say, regardless of who you decide to play and how you decide to play him, you do have access to a significant level of power, assuming I can find the freaking master. So many lords, look at this. This is, okay, so I'll have him in one turn. So you have a great deal of power, and on top of that, you have Wolf 1 itself. Wolf 1 is a powerhouse of a campaign area. It has a plentiful amount of resources, it's relatively safe on the campaign map, it's very difficult to conquer for anyone invading it, because you have Alariel over here in the Gaian Vale and Avalorn, you have Tyrion and Lothern in Atane, and you have Elfarion in Northern Vrest. So you have 3 legendary lords that do like each other, close together, and can form easy alliance between each other. If you're playing someone like Alifanar, it is a bit more complicated. If you're playing Emmerich, obviously that is difficult. That can be difficult, though you do have a gateway back to Ulfuan. And if you're playing Teclis, well, don't play Teclis, because he is the only legendary lord of the High Elves who actually has a bad campaign. But regardless, the High Elves do have a great level of, great degree of early game power. And also late game power, because early on, their spearmen and archer lines are fairly powerful. Late game, they got access to incredibly powerful dragons, powerful cavalry, flying units, things like arcane phoenixes, dragon princes. Even if they are lacking in armor piercing, they still have a significant amount of charge bonus in their campaign and can do fairly well. And then on top of that, you have some of the most powerful combination of heroes in an entire campaign between handmaidens, mages, lore masters, and nobles. But here's where we get into the issue. The late game, by the time you actually get to unlock all of this wonderful stuff that's over here in Tier 4 and Tier 5, you've essentially won the campaign. And to the point when I say you've won the campaign, you may conquer half the world by this point. This is not necessarily the most successful High Elven campaign. You want to look at a successful High Elven campaign, just look at Legend of Total War and what he did recently playing as Tyrion. Understand that what he and he made a point in that stream, in the most recent stream that he did on the subject. He said this, that he only encountered one very, very challenging battle in that entire playthrough, where he's literally conquering the world, or a good portion of it, for bad climate, and he only encounters one army that actually gives him pause. And honestly, it's because he kind of underestimated the foe that he was dealing with, and it ended up being a bit difficult. That is normal for High Elves. You will steamroll through the map, very few factions will give you a challenge, and generally speaking, that challenge will happen early game. You will fight very powerful factions, and you will end up dominating them. In fact, you are playing such a faction with the High Elves, such a race, that powerful legendary lords like Be'lakor, you might just literally farm for experience. This is something that I do in my Alain and Art campaigns. I literally end up farming Be'lakor for experience. And even pushing yourself to the extreme with, like, you picking up the Sword of Cain, which affects your public order in a significant fashion, is only going to slow you down. It will not stop you. There are, however, issues in the High Elves. First off, their economy, while certainly good, is not a top-tier economy. Why is that? Well, it's because early on, when you're looking at Tier 1, they only generate 100 income for a Tier 1 economic building. Now, this is not necessarily the worst in the world, and the ratio that they actually have to work with is certainly not the worst. Like, you look at the cost over here, it's not the worst in the world. There are races that have it worse because they are also generating trade resources. So as long as you have some trading partners, you're not looking at generating just 100 income, you're going to generate more. While not all of your elven trinkets are going to be purchased, in point of fact, over here in this campaign, only 48% of them are being purchased, you're not just looking at generating 100 income, you're generating more. You also have a good amount of post-battle loot and potentially a good amount of replenishment. And I say all of this because there is an issue, a fairly fundamental issue that makes playing them again, that kind of kills their replayability. Again, compared to many other races in the game, like the Empire, Dwarves, and others, the problems of the High Elves are relatively insignificant in comparison, but I feel they're worth highlighting. So the problem for the High Elves, one of the first issues, is climate. And what I mean by that is climate can certainly be a limiting factor when you are playing a High Elf campaign. It may not necessarily be the best climate that you deal with in the world. You may feel climate limitations, because while you generally will have Wolf 1 and you will have Frozen, depending on who you're playing on, with some exception, that is kind of all you're going to have. You're going to have very limited climate, so a lot of the map that you will deal with is not going to be pleasant climate. It's going to be unpleasant climate or uninhabitable climate. So you end up being limited and spending a significant amount of resources to develop regions in that climate. So a lot of Lustria is not available to the High Elves in their campaigns, a lot of the Empire, the Darklands, unless you're playing Elfarian, mountains, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the map ends up being not worth going for. You can certainly use a climate penalty removal mod if you want to play a more unique High Elf campaign, but then we will start to have to talk about victory conditions. Alarielle is actually in a great spot over here, but Tyrion and others are not necessarily so. Like Alarielle for her short campaign victory condition, which gives her a significant amount of benefits, including free hero capacity. That is good. She just needs to eliminate the starting enemy factions on Ulfwan, and then eliminate Nakari on Ulfwan. This is, by the way, a very sensical campaign victory condition. For others, it's not quite as sensical. Tyrion needs to eliminate Malekith, who is exactly on the opposite side, right over here. Eliminating Malekith is a long-term prospect that may take you dozens of turns. So it's not really a great situation. Or Alif and may need to eliminate Malekith. Regardless, you have certain campaigns don't necessarily have the best short campaign victory conditions, and this doesn't necessarily just apply to the High Elves, it applies in many other races. What's even worse is the long campaign victory condition, because you might think, okay, you'll eliminate Morathi, you'll eliminate Malekith, but after that it gets annoying. So you do have a campaign victory, you may have a campaign victory condition to eliminate Helopron. In this case, she has certainly fallen. But you may have a campaign victory condition that requires you to go all the way to freaking Cafe to deal with Lokir, though he may be dead. And one to deal with Rekarth over here in Lustria. Having to go on this world tour to win your long campaign victory condition is not an especially great dynamic, especially when you combine it with the climate situation. So that is not particularly fun to deal with. But furthermore, beyond the climate issues and the campaign victory situation, you also have a fairly substantial problem as the High Elves. In the baseline High Elf campaign, let's use Tyrion for instance, or even Teclis, you will only gain, let's just use Tyrion. In the Tyrion campaign, you will only gain 2 heroes until you reach tier 4 or you achieve your short campaign victory condition. You'll gain 1 mage, exactly 1 mage, and if you're playing Tyrion, you'll start 1, and 1 noble. That is all. For a very, very long time. Because you need to get to a tier 4 settlement in order to unlock any kind of additional hero capacity. And you also need buildings. Now, you can get 2 heroes, the Lore Masters and Mages, from a tier 4 settlement from the Grand Repository, but you will need an Elven Court, which is a tier 4 building to increase your noble capacity, and you may also need to get the Greater Grove tier 4, or if you're playing Alarielle, you'll need to get the Handmaiden's Gallery, but that is a tier 3 building. That is one of the main benefits in Alarielle's campaign, that she can actually increase hero capacity at tier 3. Incidentally, she's the only one that can increase hero capacity at tier 3. There are some skill lines with Emmerich and all that can increase noble capacity, but you don't just have the ability of constructing building to increase hero capacity. This is what makes Alarielle the best High Alpha Legendary Lord, because she can get a lot of heroes earlier on, and she can mass them. And so you end up in a situation where you are going to be gallivanting around the campaign map for the first few dozen turns with just armies made up of spearmen and archers, maybe some rangers if you want to spice things up, but no heroes or very limited heroes, and it is going to be very difficult to increase that capacity. And even when you increase that capacity, you are going to have to move those heroes from a very long distance away for them to get to the front line. This is a race that thrives on aggression, that does play that aggression game, but at the same time, it ends up being fairly dull, because your archer spearman army is all you're really going to use, and all that you want to use. It's not that you don't have any other tools in your arsenal. You do, except those tools require you to get to tier 4. You do have some benefits to global recruitment, but let's just put it like this. It is not economically sound to recruit anything other than spearmen and archers. Maybe Silver and Guard and archers with light armor. Personally, I only recruit archers with light armor. I will only ever recruit regular archers, the ones without armor, if I'm in a situation where I don't have a barracks. All you need is tier 1 barracks, And generally speaking, I'll just recruit archers with light armor. And eventually get some silvering guard. But everything else, kind of fluff, really, in a campaign. You might want to get some artillery, but you don't necessarily need artillery to win sieges because your archers are quite capable of doing so. Besides, you can get the Invocation of Val, which can bust down walls if you so desire in a particular battle. So the variety that you actually experience in a High Elf campaign with your units, unless you're playing Alfarian, and to a far lesser extent Alifanar, and only really for Alifanar's army, where you get Shadow Walkers and Shadow Warriors for his army, and only for his army, because it's the only one that's economically viable. In every other army for the vast majority of Legendary Lords, Archers and Spearmen, Silvering Guard, eventually, maybe some Lauder and Sea Guard if you want to, maybe some Eagle Claw bolt throwers. Everything else, the entire cavalry chain is useless, the entire grove chain is useless. You might argue that while Lions of Crix are worth it, because they are decently armored and do a lot of armor-piercing damage, but suffice to say, Silvering Guard with archers are significantly better. It's a question about army composition, really, and while Lions could do decently, they just don't fit within the army comp that you're building, the one that works far better. You do have better units later on. If you're playing Alariel, you do get Sisters of Avalor at tier 3, but you're not really going to want to get them at tier 3, really. In fact, you may not even want to get the Handmaiden's Gallery until much later on in your campaign because of the specifics of Alariel's campaign. Like, you might say, well, Alariel is all about Sisters of Avalor. Get a lot of those. In reality, you don't want to, because again, having more armies is more viable in terms of a campaign, because you will cover more ground far more effectively. Like over here, sure, I could afford maybe 1 or 2 more armies of spearmen and archers if I wanted to, but right now I am pushing it already with 8 armies, and not necessarily full armies over here. And I am covering a lot of territory and conquering a lot of ground. I have defeated Marathi, I've defeated Astankia, I've taken over Ulfwan, I've defeated Be'lakor, and I am harassing Wulfric and trying to harass Malice Darkblade, assuming that Malice Darkblade could be defeated by this army. Suffice to say, I've sent a huge concentration of my hero combat power just to, well, try and defeat Malice Darkblade, which is probably not going to happen considering the concentration of forces. I might have gotten that army killed over here in this particular campaign. Sometimes you can take stupid risks and it doesn't necessarily work in your favor. Although, to be fair, if these heroes do get wounded, well, that's not necessarily great. But for the most part, increasing hero capacity is really annoying. The only exception here is Alariel, just because she gets the Servant of Isha, which gives you Handmaiden recruitment in all provinces and increases Handmaiden capacity by 2. You already have 1, so you're looking at 3, then you add 2 more, so you end up having a significant amount of Handmaidens in a campaign. But that is the exception, not the rule. And while you can do the same thing with Emmerich, with nobles, it's not quite the same. And the problem is with what I'm saying about the limitation of your unit variety because it's just more economically viable to recruit a bunch of archers, and the issue with heroes because you can only increase capacity at tier 4, you end up with a faction that ends up being fairly limited in the mid game. So basically the first 20 turns of a campaign as the High Elves, great experience. Everything after turn 60, pretty great as well. Between turns 20 and 60, which is the meat of a campaign when you are going to struggle very significantly, like, let me put it like this. Once I get to turn 6, by the time I'll reach turn 60 in this campaign, I'll have conquered all of this territory. I don't have to worry about Lustra because I'm allied with Mazdamundi, and I might just send Tyrion to help Alfarian take out Gavenblight. So by the point I'm at turn 60, when I can actually increase hero capacity at a reasonable rate, the campaign is over. It's just mop-up. There's nothing particularly interesting, and you can certainly play by a particular rule set to make things more interesting, but you'll just end up in kind of a dull campaign dynamic where you don't actually end up using a significant amount of the power. And the power is there. I wish to stress it out. Handmaidens are the most ridiculous hero in the entire game. Each of them increases your control in all provinces by 1. Each of them gives you 2 diplomatic relations. Each of them gives you 1 influence per turn. The significance of the power that they have, each handmaiden brings to a campaign, let alone the 8 that I have in this campaign, cannot be understated. There is a huge level of power that you get access to with a lot of handmaidens in a campaign. Similarly, if you start spamming heroes, mages, nobles, lore masters, and handmaidens all together, you end up with doom stacks of heroes that are very difficult to defeat and have a huge amount of combat power. Basically, the High Elf early game is dominant, the High Elf late game is probably one of the best in the entire series, but the High Elf mid game is just dull, and it's the mid game that's the crucial element, and what I feel needs a rebalancing. So basically, I feel right now that the High Elves are too focused on the late game potential. I think that at least some heroes you should be able to get some hero capacity earlier on. So maybe keeping handmaidens from a provincial capital, but allowing you to increase capacity at tier 3 through the Grove. Besides, that's going to be a sacrifice anyway. So increasing hero capacity at tier 3 as opposed to tier 4. There are still races that would get a lot more heroes. Skaven, Greenskins, Dark Elves would still get a lot of hero capacity, far more so. But you would at least have some more tools in the toolbox, and you can make the mid-game more interesting and varied. I think there needs to be a rebalance in terms of the economy, less dependent on trade, so maybe a bit more income for their economy, but so we abuse the trade system less than we currently do. And maybe don't require 100 control to get that 50% economic benefit. Maybe just remove that, because right now it's just too heavily pushing towards the late game where it doesn't matter. Effectively, if you're playing a High Elf campaign, by the time you actually unlock the full power of the race, there's nothing to it. And in fact, it's even worse because you spend a lot of the campaign kind of limited, so by the point you get all of the things that are up here and the full economic potential, as well as the full potential of your research tree, you are already steamrolling. And there's nothing particularly great about that. Let me talk about the research tree. The High Elf research tree is an annoying pain in the neck. You require tier 4 to unlock things like cultural advancements, and these things are really powerful. Maritime Empire is no joke because it opens up more trading partners. Spy networks are significant. Waystone network is significant. There's no real way to increase research rate as the High Elves, but there's a lot of useful things. Things that you will never see in a campaign because, well, as I said, you're playing the campaign, your basic army is very, very powerful. The only thing you really want to get access to is precise fletching, which means getting a mage tower at tier 3 so you can get military advancements 2 and get precise fletching. Once you do that, nothing else quite matters. Well, martial law does matter for the upkeep for spearmen, rangers, and archers, but that's roughly it. So things like archer prowess. In fact, early game, you might just be researching a bunch of things in military advancements 1, like that you may not necessarily need, like cartridge ammunition, which is kind of pointless, just because you are required to get to tier 3 to unlock anything else, like trade advancements or military advancements too. The High Elves were designed for a more slower paced campaign style than we currently have in Warhammer 3. You can make whatever argument you want about how the campaign playstyle should be, but I think it is very clear that the campaign playstyle of Warhammer 3 is certainly favoring fast-paced campaigns. Maybe it shouldn't, that's a different discussion. But given the way things are, I think that races should be balanced around that particular playstyle. The High Elves are really dominant in the early game, as I state. The first 20 turns, very few factions can stand up to them. After the first 20 turns, they slow down a bit. They're still really powerful, but you end up suffering a lot of annoyances. Basically, as the High Elves, it's very easy to reach much further than you should and end up biting off more than you can chew. I'm sure this particular example is a great one. Though, believe it or not, I might just be able to win. I mean, I still have gold-ranked units and a level 22 Lord with a huge amount of skills. Might need to give him some items, though, to really improve the situation. That's kind of how the ridiculousness of this affair actually is with the High Elves in a lot of ways. You push things, and you push things, and you push things, and then you realize you can win to a degree that very few factions actually can. And it ends up losing its charm very quickly, actually, in point of fact, in a way that you might not necessarily expect early on. But it does end up happening. And you end up with a massive empire where there's not necessarily a lot to it. Now, you could argue that the Chaos Dwarfs have a similar dynamic, that they have the similar problem. They do very well in the early game. In this case, I think the Chaos Dwarfs have been all wiped out. No, well, I mean, they're still Astrogoth. But the Chaos Dwarves have a similar issue. But here's the thing. The Chaos Dwarves have a way of overcoming it. You don't have the same limitation on hero capacity as the High Elves do. You don't need to get to tier 4 to get more than one hero type, for instance, or achieve your short campaign victory condition. And if you want to increase the unit variety in your armies, you can do so fairly early on. You just have to pay the armament cost for it to increase unit capacity. It is just generally better to focus on building a massive industry and waste like 10 turns that you might like slow down by about 10 turns in terms of like just getting more blunderbusses and Chaos Dwarf warriors. But you can certainly play with a more varied toolbox as the Chaos Dwarfs if you so want in their campaign. That isn't necessarily the problem. I think the Chaos Dwarves do handle this situation generally better. The High Elves, they're powerful, but I think like they could use some retouching, some rebalancing to make them fit within the context of the meta of Warhammer 3 better. That is my perspective on it. Let me know what you guys think. Costine signing out.